This is the Classical Ideas Podcast. Welcome to the Classical Ideas Podcast. This is Greg Soden. Today's topic is a book and history discussion about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Mormonism. If you are looking for the basics of how a practitioner sees this faith, I highly recommend you check out my episode with Ryan Jenkins back in number 11. My episode with Ryan is one of the most popular downloaded episodes of this podcast, which I suspect is because LDS is very little understood or completely misunderstood among huge swaths of the American public. My students frequently cite Mormonism as a religion with which they are hugely unfamiliar. If you were among that crowd, you could do much worse than spending a little bit of time with Ryan's episode. Today's talk is about much of Mormon and LDS history in the United States. The conversation goes really deep on several topics, such as the Mormon involvement in American politics, the history of race in Mormonism with regards to African and Native American peoples, a discussion about why Mormons aren't considered Christians by many modern American Christian communities, and how to academically study religions when one doesn't practice those religions that they are studying. So my guest today is Dr. Perry Mueller. Perry Mueller received his PhD from Harvard University. He is a historian of American religion and an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He is the author of the new book, Race and the Making of the Mormon People, published by the University of North Carolina Press in September of 2017. Dr. Mueller is a wellspring of information, and our conversation is very fast-paced and lively. So without further delay, I bring you Dr. Perry Mueller. Welcome to the Classical Ideas Podcast. I'm here today with Dr. Max Mueller, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Nebraska. Dr. Mueller, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm curious if you can go ahead and just introduce yourself a little bit to the audience and maybe talk about your scholarly interests.
Sure, happy to do so. Depending on, I'm not sure exactly who you reach in terms of audience, but I like to insist on Perry Mueller for disambiguous, just to clear things up. I don't know if you know of the famous German, Anglo-German philologist by the name of Friedrich Max Mueller. So,
absolutely.
Okay, so
yeah.
I do like to insist on that middle name. No, there is no relation, first of all, and my parents were not religious studies scholars, but kind of planting a seed of perhaps a career in following in the illustrious footsteps of Friedrich Max Mueller. But anyway, so yeah, I'm a scholar of American religious history at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I focus mostly on, in terms of my scholarship, on 19th century America and the relationships between race and religion, and how race and racial and religious identities and experiences are mutually constitutive in the 19th century American experience, especially looking on toward the margins of mainstream American society, and that's hence perhaps one of my interests in looking at Mormons and people of African descent and native peoples, and not quite white, quote unquote, in the understanding of whiteness in the 19th century, those type of communities, to see if what kind of lessons we can glean about how religion and race function together in American history. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about myself. I finished up my PhD at Harvard University in 2015 and had the great experience of working with many different wonderful scholars at Harvard. And that's kind of a little bit about my background in terms of my scholarly background. I was actually born in Casper, Wyoming, so on the Mormon Trail, so to speak, and had a lot of Mormon playmates growing up in Casper, the 6 years that I spent there before my family moved away. So come to that interest in Mormonism and history of the West kind of naturally.
Very cool. I love that you can appreciate the plains. I'm sitting here talking to you in Columbia, Missouri.
Sure.
So, I'm actually really grateful that you and I are on the same time zone. I've been doing several of these lately, and it's always a really fun balancing act to interview people from around the world.
Sure.
So, stepping back a little bit, so I think that being a religious studies professor, a religious studies teacher is so interesting and such a curious profession. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about your spiritual path to becoming a religious studies professor. What was your upbringing like? Did religion have anything to do with your chosen profession?
Yes. For my personal, in my personal history, it absolutely did. But I want to provide a caveat, or a big caveat, for a lot of my colleagues for whom the personal did not necessarily lead into the professional, though, of course, some of our biography provides some destiny, but not all. But absolutely, my spiritual paths, as they were, it certainly influenced my interest in religious studies. I mentioned my time spent in Casper. My folks were kind of back to the land. Kind of 1970s homesteaders, though not in a kind of formal setting or a formal community or intentional homesteading, but in some ways they considered themselves kind of that kind of post-hippie movement of homesteading. And so we called it the big house on Casper Mountain that they built, there was a greenhouse and solar heating systems, or passive heating systems, and we didn't have running water. It was pretty rough hewn, intentionally rough hewn. And I think both of my parents, even in that kind of experiment of going back to the land, were kind of showed their what I call kind of the classic religious seeker element of America's religious history. And both of my parents and me, as their only child, have continued that kind of seekerism, but in very drastically different ways. After my parents split, my father became a very conservative evangelical Christian, to a tradition in which he has remained, if not formally, at least in temperament. And my mom has passed through times in which she's been interested in being a Wiccan, Unitarian Universalist, an Episcopalian, a Quaker, some other goddess kind of movements. So both of my parents are very interested in questions of spirituality, of questions of finding kind of ultimate truth and meaning in the world. And so I spent a lot of time going between my parents' households when I was growing up, spending summers with my dad in the West, and every other weekend, sometimes when he eventually moved to upstate New York, with him, going to a very, very, traditional, or not even traditional, non-denominational Bible churches. On one weekend, I'd spend that hearing about sermons about the rapture and the coming of Christ, and the other weekends, in post Christian, post-Jewish UU communities. So a pretty varied, diverse kind of religious formation. And so I was always interested, once I got to college and certainly in graduate school, interested in sussing out those questions of ultimate meaning, which I saw both my parents investigating in. And since I was a little tyke, I always knew I wanted to be a historian, but I ended up in religious studies classes in college, and in part because I wanted to kind of work out my own kind of faith journey, and really in some ways understand my parents better, in particular my relationship with my father. So that's a long way of saying that for me, the personal certainly is part of my vocation. But I had one of my students, a very bright student, was in. All my students are bright, of course. If ever a University of Nebraska student were to listen to this, one of my equally as any bright students was in asking me about Mormonism, and if you get me talking about Mormonism, a faith I probably know best, besides perhaps even better than my own. She asked me, well, you know all this stuff about Mormonism? And this is a question that I've gotten asked by missionaries too. Why didn't you become a Mormon? And, this is true kind of about religious studies. If you know all this stuff about religion, why haven't you found a religion that you're interested in particular? And I say, well, the classic answer for religious studies folks is, well, a cancer doctor doesn't need to have cancer, right?
Sure.
So the thing we study doesn't have to be necessarily so personal, but in some ways it is for me. And in fact, I think it is truly personal for us all, that it manifests in different ways for all of us. But yeah.
So you have this great new book out. It's about 90 days old now, Race and the Making of the Mormon People. And I've been diving into this for the last couple of weeks now. And so one of the things that really strikes me is my connection with my own students. So over the last several years as a religious studies teacher, I've taught many Mormon students, and they see that I am very open and interested in different religions. So sometimes they open up to me. And some of my young LDS folks are honestly traumatized by the notion that LDS isn't considered Christianity because they very much consider themselves to be Christian. So in your book, Race and the Making of the Mormon People, I'm looking for little ways that I can connect with my students a little more as well. And you mentioned that Mormons often aren't viewed as Christian by other modern Mormons because of something called the open canon. Can you briefly give us a Christian versus non-Christian argument about the open canon debate and why some Christians say Mormons aren't Christian to kind of frame this conversation?
Sure. Yeah, so, right, this is a live question. Mormonism's place within broader Christianity, and when I just taught a survey on American religious history, and one of the things I did at the end to kind of test my students' understanding of the debates between kind of what will, lack of a better word, traditional Christianity. I think that's fair, or traditional Protestantism versus Mormonism's innovations. They would probably call them certainly restorations of the faith. We kind of made a list of things that really distinguished between this traditional notions of Protestantism and Mormonism. One is certainly the open canon, which relates to a few things. So in the 18-teens and 1820s, in Joseph Smith's upstate New York, there were hot debates about how to properly do things, mostly about doing things, mostly about performing different kinds of rituals. In particular about baptism or ordination of ministers into to be Christian ministers. What was the godly? What was the biblical? As in biblical canon. What did the Bible canon have to say about proper whether infant baptism should be allowed, or whether you needed a professional priest class, or could the apostolic succession just be passed along from priesthood holder to priesthood holder by the laying on of hands? And he noticed that Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists were all fighting fiercely. It's funny to think about Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians fighting fiercely now, since a lot of the denominations folks move in and out of fairly comfortably now. But these were issues of debated as eternal damnation if they weren't properly conducted. And Joseph Smith was frustrated, as he tells us in his various histories, about all the, as he put it, sectarian fights occurred. And he found it frustrating that the source material was a Bible that had been passed that was not in its original language, of course, that had been passed from translator to translator, from one language to another, basically through millennia. And Joseph Smith kind of observed and was told in what Mormons call the first vision, that none of these various faith traditions had it right, and that soon the father and the son told Joseph Smith in this first vision. Well, that happened, and we're not sure exactly when it happened for him, but in his mid-teens, that another truer gospel would be restored to the world that would solve all of these really thorny questions about liturgy and ecclesiology, and then lo and behold, a decade and a half or so later, Joseph Smith publishes the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon is the first installation into what becomes part of the Mormon canon of scriptures that both adds to and seeks to correct biblical canon. And so the Mormons, not only with the Book of Mormon's kind of addition, but the Mormons believe that God continues to speak, as I say, in the present tense, first to Joseph Smith, the first prophet of the Mormon movement, but also to his successors, and that the prophets have been the age of prophecy and kind of the writing of Scripture has been returned to the world. The Presbyterians, the Baptists, and the Methodists would all have said, "Oh, the time of miracles, the time when God was speaking to humanity, it kind of directly has passed, and so we have to basically infer what God's truth is from this closed canon." But no, the Mormons said no. The canon has been reopened. So the Book of Mormon adds to this, adds to the Bible. It's not that the Book of Mormon replaces the biblical canon, but helps to make a clear pronouncement, especially on these issues of liturgy and ecclesiology. But also new writings, new scriptures can be made, new additions to the canon about what God, or as the Mormons put it, as the Mormons call him, Heavenly Father, has to say to his contemporary or his contemporary church, and will speak to the contemporary church. And so obviously a lot of Christians would find this abhorrence, that there could be new scriptures, there could be new additions to the Bible, or maybe not even to the Bible, but new additions that they should hold in such reverence to the Bible, and so they find that notion that God is still speaking to a bunch of currently now octogenarians in Salt Lake City, kind of abhorrent and very, very troubling, since the Protestant Reformation, the Bible has been understood as the sign of, the signifier of prophecy and truth, but also contains it both in its in its limited form, right?
Yeah.
It's despite its limited form, it's ever speaking from those particular words. So Protestants remine this. There's actually a Islamic idea that I think fits really well to it. It's called ijtihad. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but ijtihad, which basically translates to, if I understand it correctly, going back to the sources and finding truth there, returning to the sources and finding new truth there that you hadn't noticed before, which is what kind of classical Protestant exegesis does. And the Mormons are certainly great biblical and Book of Mormon exegetes, but they also understand that new messages can be delivered. So,
awesome.
That's a long way of kind of framing open canon.
Well, it's complicated, and you really have to pay attention to the details when you get into this stuff. Otherwise, there's a lot of trouble that could come from it.
Sure.
And in that open canon, we have things like the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine of Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, and things like that. So I think it's important to pay attention to those distinctions.
Sure.
So let's get into the weeds here on your book a little
Sure.
bit, because I have so many questions on your book, and I know we're
Great.
not going to be able to talk about everything, but I'm
Sure.
just excited about this text.
Great.
So
Terrific.
most people wouldn't tend to think about race necessarily when discussing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Like in like the big history of it, maybe today, we have our preconceived notions about what it is or is not. But can you talk a little bit about the history of Mormonism in relation to race, specifically the significance of like pre-Columbian Nephite and Lamanites who
Sure.
are viewed as being cursed or not cursed,
Sure.
or people on how the Book of Mormon sets the stage for discussions of race on the North American continent?
Sure. I would. Do people not think of race when they think of kind of Mormon history? It depends on what we mean by race, and that's kind of one of the main questions that I raise in the book, right? What I'm trying to do in the book is, first of all, is actually take a step back of how we in the 21st century conceive of race, and return to the early 19th century and understand how 19th century Americans and mostly 19th century Americans understood questions of race as a category. And today when we think of race, mostly because of America's history, in particular of slavery and exclusion of people, in particular people of African descent from citizenship, freedom, the ballot box, et cetera, schools. Race has been kind of understood as kind of a black-white binary, and so one of the main focuses is to return to the early 19th century when race wasn't as clearly in the United States clearly understood as such a black-white binary. So I don't know. I wonder if that's perhaps most people wouldn't think of race as one of the main issues in Mormon history, perhaps not as much as polygamy, certainly, or if folks know anything about Mormon history, the Mountain Meadows massacre. I'm just kind of listing the most perhaps things that folks know about Mormonism who aren't familiar with them. But I would say a lot of folks, especially who came of age, say in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s, would think of race as a major issue within the LDS Church, in part because of the century-plus long history of excluding, in particular, people of African descent from full membership, as I clunkily phrase it, full membership, which basically means exclusion from the priesthood, which almost all males hold in the LDS Church. It's a lay priesthood, and from the most sacred rooms to the temple. The church had a prescription and prohibition on people of African descent accessing those offices and those spaces, which are really, really important to both Mormon identity and also Mormon understandings of the hereafter. That said, so Mormons, in some ways did adopt, because of their history of exclusion of people of African descent, which lasted until 1978. And speaking of an open canon, which, according to the prophets of the church in 1978, they received a revelation to end that ban and welcome people of African descent as full members of the church. And it's just next year is the 40th anniversary of what is now canonized as they call it Declaration 2, official Declaration 2 of the church, and which in June 1978 this revelation was received. And it's important to kind of think about how this revelation came about, to understand, kind of back to the question on open canon. One of the things that I think a lot of folks don't understand about revelation and how it works in Mormonism in terms of how the prophets get revelation. It's not a lightning bolt sent down from heaven, or more directly a piece of parchment that falls down from heaven, for a new revelation. The prophets gather this has a lot to do with kind of Mormon understandings of human agency. The prophets gather and the prophets have to ask the right questions, right? So humanity has to be prepared to ask the right questions to receive the right answers. So they were ready in 1978. A lot of people, kind of apologists for this racial policy, would say the church was finally ready. The world was finally ready for the church leaders to ask the question. And so they asked the question and received the answer. to end this racist policy. But back to questions of the Book of Mormon and Nephites and Lamanites. What the Book of Mormon does, and what the Book of Mormon introduced to American understandings of race, was to reframe the whole Christian drama, biblical Christian drama, away from the old world and onto the new world. And so many of the same kind of family spats that happen in the Hebrew Bible are reappear in a different form in some ways on the American continent. The Book of Mormon very briefly tells the story of a Israelite family that leaves Israel, flees Israel in the 6th century BC, and heads into the wilderness, which readers of the Book of Mormon in the early when it was first introduced, kind of understood as the Americas. And this family eventually splits into two rival factions, the Nephites and the Lamanites. And the Nephites, more or less, though this is complicated, it's a very complicated text, the Book of Mormon, more or less are presented as the godly people, the keepers of the faith, the keepers of the records, which is really, really important for my own work. They keep the records of this history and their pre-American history, and they're less faithful, less literate kin, the Lamanites, split off and become idolatrous, savages. Although again, this is complicated. There are points when the Nephites are less valiant in the Book of Mormon history than the Lamanites. But basically, because of this split, the Lamanites are cursed for rejecting basically the gospel and the leadership of the Nephites. They are cursed, and the curse manifests in the Book of Mormon as dark skin. And Mormons and other early readers of the Book of Mormon in the early 19th century understood the Lamanites as the ancestors to modern day Native Americans. So the Book of Mormon sees these people, these Lamanites turned Native, or who eventually become Native Americans, as at once heirs, literal heirs to the oldest of covenants, the Abrahamic covenants. These are Israelites who had literally lost their way and forgotten the faith of their forefathers. But they are also, in their current state, in the early 19th century, understood as, savages, enemies of civilization, the classic stereotypes of quote unquote the Indian in the American imagination. So the Book of Mormon both at once reinforces this notion of Indian as savage and Indian as enemy of civilization, but also upends it because it understands this Indian as actually Lamanite and going back even farther, Israelite. And the Book of Mormon prophesizes that one day these Lamanites would eventually not only be restored to the knowledge of their forefathers, but take the lead in creating a new Jerusalem to which Christ would return in his second coming. And so that was really the kind of understanding of early Mormon understanding of Native Americans. They were particularly interested, because of the Book of Mormon, in reaching out to Native Americans and converting them, seeing Native Americans as key to bringing about the second coming of Christ.
And in comes Joseph Smith,
yep.
Right? So Joseph Smith comes in with the Book of Mormon, and so what does it mean to you when he says he was to, quote, gather together a restored chosen people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's the gathering is a key feature in the literal gathering of Zion, is a key feature of Mormon theology, and it remains so. It's one of the articles of faith, which is also kind of canon, is the literal gathering of Zion in the Americas. So the gathering would certainly include, in the earliest years, in this kind of early Mormon imagination of this new world community, or new, actually not world community, but this new city that they'd build, certainly would include Native Americans who had been restored to the knowledge of their true lineage, their true ancestry back to Israel. And it would also include quote unquote Gentile, so Anglo-American, Euro-American converts who had also accepted the kind of Mormon gospel in this gathering of in this new city of New Jerusalem that Joseph eventually prophesied or would be built in and around Independence, Missouri. That was kind of the original vision where New Jerusalem would be restored. So that was what the Book of Mormon foretold, and that's what the early church tried to bring about, is this literal gathering of the faithful to this city, and they build this city a righteous city of both converts, both Anglo-American, Euro-American, and Native, who would live together and build this city to await Christ's return. And as they built it, and this is one of the understandings of kind of race in Mormonism, curses, we haven't really talked about those, but curses like those that were pronounced upon the Lamanites, which were manifest in dark skin, and which the ancestors of the original supposed wicked folks who received these curses, the manifestation of them would also disappear in this new city. So these Lamanite peoples would be restored to their original non-race status, which in kind of early 19th century understandings of race, and I would argue even 21st century American understandings of race is a kind of a form of whiteness, right? In American understandings of race, right? White is the default race. White is the raceless race. Of course, it's very much pregnant with meaning. This is true in kind of Christian, traditional Christian understandings of race, quote unquote Christian understandings of race, but also certainly Mormon understandings of race, that race is not of God, necessarily of God's design. Race enters into human history as a result of sin, human sin, and race in terms of race as demarcation, marking off one set of the human family for the other. It's a punishment because one branch of the human family rose up and sinned against the other. So it's a way of separating the righteous from the wicked within the human family. And the Mormon understanding of race is that race is much more mutable category, and race could be overcome, and those who belong to cursed lineages, especially peoples of Native descent, Native American people, could be restored to their kind of true non-raced status. So that's what the vision was for this gathering.
So Joseph Smith seems to present him. So in the book, he seems to give off the impression that he's trying to gather together people, right, regardless of skin color in the moment. Yeah. So do you think that Joseph Smith Jr. thought that his views in the 1830s and 1840s were sort of a version of anti-racism, since he was trying to incorporate those societies across skin color?
Yeah, I mean, the anti-racist certainly is a very 2017 word.
Yeah.
2016, 2017 word. But yeah, I mean, Joseph Smith says himself, that, or actually God through Joseph Smith says he's called to bring about the restoration of all things, to end all schisms within the human family, for those who are willing to believe. Those are political divisions, those are certainly religious divisions, and those are also racial divisions. So race was one of the divisions within the human family that would end with a restoration of the true gospel. So yes, I mean, I do think Joseph Smith, I don't necessarily think it's probably right for us to call him an anti-racist.
Yeah, and I have a second part to that question too.
Yeah, but his views, it's kind of, again, from our 21st century understandings of what an anti-racist means, which is not a destruction of non-white racial categories or ending of non-white racial categories because those categories are somehow inferior. That would certainly not be anti-racist.
Right.
But his views were certainly radical in their inclusion. That, one of the things I think that the point my book tries to make is that that because these categories, again, were not of God's design, right? They were the kind of race enters into history because of the fall in some ways, or a second fall in particular, a second fall among certain branches of the human family. So if these branches of the human family can be restored to the true knowledge of their selves and their true parentage, and restored to the true faith, then they can overcome those schisms. And so that's pretty radical, especially in 1830 when the Book of Mormon was published. And let's not forget, this is the same year that Andrew Jackson signs into law the Indian Removal Act, and culminating in the forced removal of Indian peoples west of the Mississippi. Andrew Jackson says in his address to Congress in December 1830 that this is the happy consummation of this project, and his vision of this new republic was that the Indian could never be an American, right? Because of their Indianness, no matter what they did, they could never become an American citizen. And so Native communities, for example, most infamously, like the Cherokees, who had done everything they possibly could to prove that they were capable of being citizens. The Cherokees had translated the Bible into their own language. They had created their own written language. They had written their own constitution. Right? They had set up a nation, a Cherokee nation, to prove that they could be civilized Anglo-American, present themselves as capable and equal Anglo-American, or at least the image of Anglo-Americans, which had been the idea of the Puritan, for example, Puritan missionaries to the native peoples said, hey, once we get these folks civilized, they can become part of our new community. But by the time Joseph Smith introduces the Book of Mormon to the world, the idea of an Indian as an innate, fixed, immutable category was very much a part of American culture and American U.S. policy under Andrew Jackson. So presenting this radical view that no, race is immutable, and in fact it's our mandate, our divine mandate to restore these native peoples to their true selves, and then they will eventually lead the restoration and even lead this new millennial city, was very, very scary for the racial politics of 1830.
Yeah.
And gets Joseph Smith, one of the reasons why the Mormons get into so much trouble in their early years and get run out of New York, and then Ohio, and then later Missouri, and then eventually Illinois.
Yeah, and I mean, so today we talk about cultural genocide, right? Which is basically what Smith almost seems to also be advocating, because the intention is to breed the darker skin tones out of people over time once they convert. So whenever I say that he looks like a version of anti-racism, like it's racist still, because you're trying to breed out color out of people, and so that's a really, really sticky point, and so it's really important, I think, to look at him and where he was in the society at the time. Sure. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about Africa. So I've recently been finding some stories about how Mormonism has actually become quite popular in Africa, and yet Mormonism is essentially an American homegrown religion. Why is this trend of Mormonism rising in Africa? Because I know that half of the world's Mormons or so live outside of the United States.
Yeah. So I think the flip happens in sometime in the 2000s, maybe as late as 2010. I'm not exactly sure.
Wow.
But the church announced that half, the church's growth is taking place mostly in Africa and the African diaspora, in Central and South America. The biggest community, the nation with the largest home of numbers of Mormons in the world outside of the U.S. is actually Mexico, so not quite Africa. But anyway, maybe we could talk about this at the end, but the real tension, I think, for Mormonism in the going forward in the 21st century has less and less to do with whiteness and more to do with Americanness. And those aren't necessarily those are terms that obviously have some overlap. But yes, so Africa is a big growth rate, and that's one of the perhaps many reasons that the church in 1978 ended its ban on people of African descent. They were having trouble sorting out the various racial politics of, say, in particular, Brazil, which has a very different racial politics than America, though a racial politics that is certainly also rooted in enslavement of people of African descent. But the missionaries down in Brazil in the 1960s and 70s were having a hard time saying, "Oh, we can't figure out if these people are a little bit African, and whether or not we should allow them to become priesthood members, et cetera, et cetera." So, the very practical reason that the missionaries were struggling to work out those racial politics was one of the reasons that the priesthood ban was ended, and also that allowed Africa, the continent, to be opened up to conversion. So I think one of the reasons that Mormonism is attractive to Africa is let's also just be fair and sincere to the people who do convert. They find truth in it. They find power in its message, in its message of family, of eternal families. In particular, I think a lot of African Mormons, and I'm not an expert on this subject or contemporary African kind of Mormon missionary work, but a lot of African Mormons aren't necessarily concerned with the Americanness as geographically specific, America as a geographical space. But I do think one of the attractions is Mormonism as an American religion because of its aspirational nature, right? Because in some ways, not unlike other traditions that come from America, that are based in America, and that go to Africa, some Pentecostal traditions, etc. The kind of I want to be careful with this, but other scholars have looked at issues around the gospel of wealth, that they're attracted to a faith that is connected to America as part of of Africans' interest in kind of upward mobility, because they see Mormons as successful, economically successful, family-oriented, conservative, also conservative in their gender roles, which are also is an attraction to a lot of African communities who also have very conservative understandings or conservative understandings of gender roles. So I think those are some of the reasons that are attractive. America is. The idea of America is very popular, despite our current age. Mormonism is, in some ways, and I don't at all mean to be reductionistic, is another kind of a very particular American brand, and that people around the world associate with America. So it's in some ways, even if they're not interested in emigrating to America, though some do. Some Africans do end up coming to BYU for school and settling in Utah and other places. I think it's in some ways, kind of looking at the sociology of it, and even social psychology of the attraction. It's America. Mormonism as a stand-in for America. The idea of America is an attractive feature. And when you join, this is another part that is very powerful. When you join the church, it's a worldwide network, right? It's a worldwide hierarchy and community that you become a part of, that both binds you in a local community, but also makes you a member of a community that's global in nature. So I think those are some of the potential reasons for why Mormonism is successful in Africa.
If there's any listeners out there curious about the community aspect of Mormonism, my episode with Ryan Jenkins on this very podcast talks a lot about community, so dive into that if you're curious. So Dr. Mueller, I'm becoming mindful of your time here, but there's a few more things I really want to ask you.
Yeah.
So shifting back to the United States, you write extensively for popular journalistic outlets like The Atlantic and Slate, because I know that you're dedicated to informing modern Americans about issues related to Mormonism and politics and all kinds of great stuff. So are Mormons historically political? Like, what do you tend to see as the moral imperative of LDS folks for jumping into the national fray of politics?
Oh boy, yes. There's certainly a lot of history there. We're in a really interesting time. It's hard not to think about the present, both what I'll call the existential threat to kind of democracy and that we're living through right now, or the restoration of American democracy. Those two I often talk about with my friends who are kind of on the activist side. You know, this current moment is really, really interesting, and I think the Mormons potentially have something to and are already playing a role in it. You know, America can kind of go down two paths, and perhaps they're not mutually exclusive. Moving towards a soft kind of form of tyranny or authoritarianism, where our small d democratic institutions cannot check the power of an authoritarian executive and his enablers in the Congress and in media. And again, these aren't mutually exclusive, we're having a moment of, creating a generation of the most politically engaged and politically aware citizens, perhaps in America's history. And perhaps, those perhaps are not mutually exclusive. I'm hoping for the latter, and that the latter will prove out to be the case to check this particular moment. And Mormons in particular are abhorred, just disgusted in some ways, not only by our current moments and our current presidents and other members of the Republican Party, say like a Roy Moore, their personal behavior, which they find very, very abhorrent, from kind of what they understood and what many of us understood as kind of family values, character issues, and personal behavior issues, personal decorum, but also threats to the democratic order. And Mormons who had long been excluded from, and for most of the 19th century, from full participation in the American democratic process, have long cherished and the institutions, some of which kept them, forced them to be excluded, and a lot of Mormons are particularly, despite the fact that many, if not most, actually, certainly in Utah, most Mormons are Republican, members of the Republican Party. They are wrestling with that membership as the Republican Party grapples with whether it's going to be the party of Jeff Flake, Mitt Romney, our senator here in Nebraska, Ben Sass, which are all of whom those three kind of represent, I would argue, especially Flake and Sass, a conservative, small government, strong checks and balances, belief that character does matter, language does matter, how our politicians act in the public arena do matter. So I'm very curious how the Mormons are going to sort themselves out, as a people, whether or not they're going to continue their relationship with the Republican Party as they move forward. And I'm aspirational. I'm kind of wishing this in truthfully in some of the writing that I do, wishing this into being, that the Mormons, and I'm not the only one hoping for this. Anthea Butler, another great scholar of religion at the University of Pennsylvania, who's also a fan and / a critic of Mormonism and Mormon history, especially on questions of race and gender, are also wishing this into being. Though neither Anthea or I are conservative Christians, we hope that there is a conservative Christian space that does value character and decorum and the rule of law. And we're wondering, since white evangelicals have abandoned that space for Trumpism, we're wondering if Mormons won't move into this void and stand up to Trumpism from kind of the right and keep keep the flame alive of kind of conservatism going through this age that it's really, how we understand conservatism, how we understand evangelicalism, and how we understand republicanism are very much live questions at this moment. So, those are all real questions. And actually, the Mormons' interest in internationalism, the Mormons' interest in and history as a persecuted people, right? There are a couple of reasons why Mormons object to kind of Trumpism, and I've talked about this elsewhere. But number one, they object to Trumpism's attack on religious minorities like Muslims. For example, the church, after Donald Trump first proposed the Muslim ban, the church hierarchy released a statement condemning the Muslim ban as antithetical to American understandings of religious freedom. Very strong statement. The church tries to be politically neutral, though it hasn't always been, especially on questions around gender. So, and that reflects kind of the Mormons' past as a religiously persecuted people, and their empathy, their shared empathy and shared experiences with religiously marginalized people. And also, the Mormons, for kind of very practical reasons, reject Trumpism's demonization of immigrants, because most of those immigrants, or with documentation or not documentation in the United States, are coming from Mexico or other Latin American spaces. And hey, as we just mentioned, that's where a lot of Mormons live. And so the church, those are Mexicans, those are potential Mormons that Trump is, denigrating with his wall talk and talk of Mexicans as rapists and murderers and the worst kind. So, all that said, very brief, Jeff Flake still is voting along party lines, as is our dear senator here, Ben Sass, and others. Mitt Romney, or if Mitt Romney were to unseat Orrin Hatch in Utah, or take Orrin Hatch's seat in Utah, he'd probably still vote along the kind of standard Republican line. So it's an interesting moment for the Mormons as they kind of sort things out.
So, last question.
Sure.
If a non-Mormon were to want to read the Book of Mormon just as an open-minded activity to be more culturally literate, what do you think a non-Mormon reader of the Book of Mormon, what would you encourage them to do to break beyond their preconceived notions about Mormonism while reading the text?
It's a real hard text. I have two recommendations. Number one, I'm going to make a plug for the book that helped me as a non-Mormon understand it. Grant Hardy, who's a professor at the University of North Carolina in Asheville. Grant Hardy, a fantastic literary scholar, has written for Oxford University Press a reader's guide to the Book of Mormon and an annotated Book of Mormon that are incredibly helpful to understand. So I would start there, and those could be procured at your local university library or online pretty easily. Those are fantastic books to help get you started. So if you want to, those would be fantastic reader's guide, right? It's hard to dive into the book of the Bible without some hand-holding. It's hard to dive into the Quran without some, prior knowledge. So that's one way. Here's another way. When those missionaries show up at your doorstep, let them in. Those 19-year-olds, let them in. Give them some non-coffee, give them a snack, and go and hey, whether or not you're interested in converting to Mormonism, have them share with you their understanding of the Book of Mormon. Have them teach you how they understand the value of the Book of Mormon. I certainly did that as part of my education. I was up front with the missionaries. I said, hey, I'm a scholar. I'm not looking to convert, but you're welcome to, if that's okay, you're welcome to hang out with me every couple of weeks and we can do some reading lessons. And boy, was that helpful for me to understand Mormon culture, but also kind of contemporary Mormon understandings of the Book of Mormon. So those are two ways to go about it. So I really can't recommend either of them more strongly. Grant Hardy's books are so fantastic, but those missionaries too will be so grateful to not have another door slammed in their face, and so grateful for someone even if they're not interested in converting, taking their tradition seriously. And I think we all should. We all should take these traditions seriously.
I have multiple students that are getting ready to leave on their own mission in a couple months, and I could tell everybody that these are the nicest young people in the world. And if you let them in, they're not going to be mean to you. It's going to be a really polite conversation.
Exactly.
So, Dr. Max Perry Mueller, I am going to cite your namesake here because you have really helped everybody live up to Max Mueller's notion that he who knows one knows none.
There you go.
So thank you for helping people understand one more. I highly recommend your book, and I am so grateful to you for your time today, and it's been a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Greg, thanks so much, and thanks so much for your time today. And I know we didn't get to one of your questions. I'm looking at here in question number 12. It's funny because I was reminded when you sent me these questions of the Articles of Faith, the LDS Church Articles of Faith. They were almost exactly the same number of them. But you mentioned Missouri, and Mormon history in Missouri is very much alive. And if you ask Mormons long enough, they'll think it's some will think that the Missouri still remains the home of the future of Mormonism. But most Mormons every day, like your dear students who are preparing for their mission, like most of us, they're not concerned about. They don't worry themselves about history of polygamy or race or these kind of things. They're just trying to live their everyday lives and care for their families, and so I think that's something to admire. So anyway, thanks for your time.
Thank you, sir, and maybe we can do a part 2 someday.
Well, I would love that. I'd love that.
The Classical Ideas podcast is written and performed by me, Greg Soden. Original music is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. His music can be found at www.wearewarmmusic.com. Thanks for listening.